The gymnasium fell silent when the coach crumpled the roster in his fist. Marcus Jordan had been cut before the words were ever spoken, the decision already calcified in a space where Marcus would never be invited to defend himself. The coach turned to face him directly. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed to something between disappointment and disgust. "You don't have what it takes," the coach said flatly. His voice carried the weight of finality, the kind of certainty that arrives without explanation. "No talent for this level. You've wasted enough of this team's time." Marcus stood motionless at the edge of the hardwood, still in his practice gear, the rubber soles of his sneakers gripping the polished floor. The coach stepped closer. His hand moved toward Marcus's jersey, the one with his name embroidered across the back, and yanked it down so hard that the elastic bit into Marcus's shoulders. The fabric tore slightly at the seam. Around them, the other players pretended to busy themselves with nothing. They looked at the floor. They looked at their laces. They looked anywhere but at Marcus's face. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. In that silence, Marcus felt the weight of something the coach could not possibly understand. But what the coach didn't know, the narrator paused, was that right at that exact moment, in the parking lot outside, 3 Division I college scouts were sitting in a parked sedan with binoculars, trained on the gymnasium window. They had been watching Marcus for 8 weeks straight, and they were not there because of anyone's doubt. Man, nah, he really thought he was making a mistake that day. Let's get into it. Marcus was 14 years old when his mother asked him to choose between lunch and shoes. They were sitting at the kitchen table in their apartment on the east side of the city, in a unit where the radiator clanged all night, and the window facing the fire escape had been sealed shut with foam and duct tape for 3 years. The eviction notice from 2 months prior was still magnetized to the refrigerator behind a child's drawing from 3rd grade. His mother worked double shifts at a hospital, pushing a cleaning cart through halls where physicians never looked her in the eye and where she was referred to by her uniform color rather than her name. She had brought home $280 in cash that week, paid in small bills that she counted twice on the counter. His shoes were separating at the sole. He could feel the concrete through the rubber when he played on the blacktop courts. The heels were worn through to the foam. His mother had been pricing replacements at the discount outlet, and the cheapest option was $95. The grocery line that week would empty their available cash if she bought both necessities. She did not explain this to Marcus with sadness in her voice. She explained it with the same flat efficiency she used to describe everything. The facts of their life were not invitations for pity, but simply the terms they occupied. Marcus looked at his mother's face and understood without her saying it that the choice was already made. He chose the shoes. 2 weeks later, his mother brought him to the tryouts at Westridge Academy, one of the city's 3 private schools with a Division I feeder program. Westridge sat on a hill overlooking the city center, built from limestone in the 1920s with a chapel tower and a playing field that had been maintained for 90 years without a crack. The tuition was $48,000 a year. Marcus's mother had found a financial aid opportunity advertised in a city bulletin, a program designed to identify exceptional students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The application required 2 letters of recommendation from teachers and an essay about resilience. His mother had spent 3 weeks drafting that essay, rewriting it on the laptop at the public library after her shift ended. In the gymnasium that day, Marcus moved differently than the other boys. He did not move like someone with economic anxiety embedded in his muscle memory. He moved like someone who had spent his whole childhood learning how to be small in spaces that made demands on his body. He learned early to navigate the narrow aisles of their apartment without knocking things over. He learned to read the tension in his mother's shoulders from across the room and adjust his own weight accordingly. He learned to compress himself, to take up less space, to move with deliberation rather than ease. When he shot the basketball, his hands remembered the arc from 1,000 hours of practice on the blacktop courts, the ones with no nets and backboards that were welded to the fence. His release was clean, his footwork was economical. His vision of the court showed a spatial intelligence that had been developed not through coaching, but through pure repetition. By the end of that tryout, he had made 15 of 18 three-point attempts. He had assisted on 4 consecutive plays with precision passes. He had not spoken once. The coach at that first tryout, a man named Tom Harrison, who had been recruiting for Division I programs for 30 years, had called Marcus's mother into his office immediately after the session ended. He had told her that in 3 decades of identifying talent, he had rarely seen that combination of instinctive movement and court sense in a freshman. He had told her that if Marcus continued on his current trajectory, he would be recruited by colleges in the top tier of the sport. He had given her his personal cell phone number and told her to call if there were any obstacles to Marcus's participation. By spring of that year, Marcus's mother had secured him a place at Westridge Academy with an 80% tuition reduction and a work-study position that covered another 15%. The remaining 5%, about $200 a month, came from a scholarship fund for student athletes that the school maintained. In the school's promotional materials, they highlighted stories of kids like Marcus. It was good press. It was also, on some level, genuine. Marcus's mother had saved every newspaper clipping that mentioned him. She had cut them carefully with scissors and placed them in a manila folder that she kept on the shelf above the refrigerator, the one that was least likely to be damaged by water leaks. She would take that folder out sometimes, when Marcus was not watching, running her fingers across the headlines. Westridge freshman earns recruitment interest. Young star shines in AHU circuit. Local teen draws scout attention. She had told Marcus, one evening after he came home from practice, that everything they had endured was for this. The apartment with the broken window. The meals that stretched further than they should have. The double shifts when her back was already breaking. The nights when she fell asleep on the couch with her work uniform still on, because she was too exhausted to change. All of it had been for him to have a door that was open. "Don't you ever forget that door is open because I pushed it," she had told him, holding his face in her hands the way she had when he was small. "You walk through it with your head up." By his sophomore year, Marcus had grown 4 inches. His game had evolved from raw instinct to something more calculated. He understood angles. He understood spacing. He understood how to manipulate a defense by moving without the basketball, a skill that separated the players who were merely talented from the players who were genuinely exceptional. Scouts from college programs began to attend Westridge's games regularly. They filled the bleachers in pairs, evaluating not just the stars but the entire roster, because they understood that a player's floor was determined by how his team moved around him. They had notebooks, they had radar guns, they had seen thousands of teenagers play, and they knew what the shape of a professional trajectory looked like in its earliest stages. By Marcus's junior year, the scouts were coming to his AAU games instead, following him to tournaments in 3 states, because the level of competition there was higher. They would sit in folding chairs along the sideline during off-season practices, watching him move in an environment without pressure, without game stakes. One scout from Duke had told Marcus's mother that her son had the physical tools and the court sense to play in college, possibly even beyond. He had said it in the parking lot after a game, leaning against his car with the casualness of someone delivering information. He had verified 100 times. He had given her a pamphlet about Duke's economics program, because Marcus was also a student, and they both knew that academic viability would be essential. It was this context, this accumulated evidence of Marcus's trajectory, that rendered the coach's decision at Westridge so incomprehensible that it initially seemed like an error, a misunderstanding, a moment that would be immediately corrected. Coach David Garrett had arrived at Westridge 3 months into Marcus's junior year, replacing Tom Harrison, who had taken a position at a Division I program. Garrett was 46 years old, white, and had spent his coaching career at 3 elite private schools in the Northeast, each position lasting 3 to 5 years before he was asked to move on. There were rumors about his methods, whispers about former players who had requested transfers, conversations that happened in parking lots and were never documented in official channels. But Westridge's athletic director, Susan Chen, had been impressed by his credentials. He had coached at a higher level than Westridge required. He had a record of winning championships. He had answered every interview question with the language of accountability and team building, the exact rhetoric that schools like Westridge wanted to hear. What Susan Chen did not know was that Garrett had a pattern of behavior that emerged. Whenever he felt that his authority was being questioned or when he encountered a student athlete who had interests or options outside his direct control. He did not respond to questions by engaging with the substance of the question. He responded by establishing dominance. He did this through public correction. He did this through playing time decisions that did not correspond to performance. He did this by making certain players feel that their presence on his team was provisional, contingent on their absolute deference. Garrett had noticed Marcus immediately, not because of how Marcus played, although Marcus was clearly the most talented player on the roster, but because of how Marcus moved through Westridge's spaces with a kind of quiet self-possession, a centering that suggested he was not performing his presence for anyone. Marcus walked to class without looking at anyone. He sat in the cafeteria without attempting to navigate the social hierarchies. He seemed to occupy Westridge Academy as someone who had already decided he belonged there, and that certainty was the one thing Garrett could not tolerate. In November, 3 weeks into the season, Garrett had benched Marcus during a game against their primary rival, a decision that contradicted all available evidence about Marcus's performance. That night, Marcus had made 8 of 10 shots in the first half. He had orchestrated the offense. He had not made a turnover. Garrett had called a timeout, made a substitution, and did not bring Marcus back into the game. When Marcus asked him after the game why he had been taken out, Garrett had responded without looking at him. "Your shot selection is sloppy. You need to understand the offense before you understand your role." The shot selection had been flawless. The offense had been executed with precision. But Marcus had nodded and said nothing, because he had learned something from his mother about when it was dangerous to argue with authority. He had learned that there were contexts in which pushing back, even with facts, would only escalate the situation. He had learned to absorb the insult and wait for the evidence to surface elsewhere. In December, Garrett implemented a new practice structure where the starting 5 played against a second team in a controlled scrimmage format. The division was not based on performance metrics, but on Garrett's subjective assessment. Marcus was placed on the second team, despite being the highest performing player on the roster. The second team wore the practice jerseys without names, the ones reserved for developmental players. Around the gymnasium, other players exchanged glances. No one said anything. The assistant coach, who had been hired specifically to evaluate player development and provide detailed feedback, had submitted his recommendations to Garrett twice in writing, both times recommending that Marcus start in the backcourt. Garrett had responded by removing the assistant coach's position. In January, the team traveled to a tournament in another state. Marcus had averaged 18 points and 9 assists through 4 games, numbers that would have guaranteed a starting position on nearly any other team in the region. On the final night of the tournament, Garrett called Marcus into a hotel room and told him that he was concerned about Marcus's attitude. Garrett had not provided examples. He had not referenced any incident. He had simply established this as a fact, stated it with the tone of someone who expected agreement. The kind of player who thinks he's bigger than the program, Garrett had said, ends up learning hard lessons. Marcus had stood in that hotel room, 1,400 miles from his mother, and had understood that he was being warned. He had understood that his value to Garrett was not his performance, but his willingness to be diminished by someone with institutional authority. He had nodded and left the room, and he had not told his mother what had been said because he had learned that sharing these moments often resulted in his mother's pain becoming worse than his own. By the end of January, the scouts had stopped coming, not because Marcus's performance had declined, but because Garrett had changed the practice schedule and had moved most games to dates when scouts rarely attended regional high school tournaments. It was a deliberate maneuver, the kind of thing that could be explained away as logistical if anyone asked. No one asked. On the 15th of February, Marcus arrived at the gymnasium for practice and found his name removed from the roster posted outside the locker room. The roster was updated 3 times per season as players were added or removed, promoted or demoted. But there was no official communication. There was no meeting. There was no opportunity for Marcus to understand what had occurred or to defend himself against it. When he walked into the gymnasium itself, Garrett was sitting on the bench, his arms crossed, his face composed into an expression of resolved disgust. "You're done," Garrett said without standing up. "You're off the team. No talent. No production when it matters. Take a walk." The other players turned to look at Marcus, and then turned away. The silence in the gymnasium was so complete that Marcus could hear the sound of his own breathing, could hear the distant sound of construction from the campus expansion happening on the far side of the property. "Yo, hold on. That man really thought nobody was paying attention. Let's see what happened next." What Garrett did not know was that the Duke scout, the one who had been attending games regularly, and who had spoken to Marcus's mother in the parking lot, had called ahead to the athletic director. He had told Susan Chen that there were 3 different colleges maintaining active recruitment files on Marcus Jordan, and that all 3 had expressed concern about the decline in his visibility during the spring season. He had asked, directly, whether there were any obstacles to Marcus's participation that Susan Chen should be aware of. The conversation had happened by telephone, and Susan Chen had written notes from it afterward, notes that would later be entered into evidence. In the parking lot outside the gymnasium, on the afternoon that Garrett cut Marcus from the team, 3 separate people sat in separate vehicles, with binoculars pointed at the window of the gymnasium. One was the Duke scout. One was a scout from the University of North Carolina. One was an independent trainer named Derek Marshall who worked with college programs to evaluate talent during high school years. All 3 had been tipped off by other scouts that something unusual was happening at Westridge, that a player they had all independently evaluated as a top 50 prospect in his graduating class had suddenly disappeared from public sight. They watched Marcus walk out of the gymnasium. They saw him sit down on the concrete steps outside, his face turned downward, his shoulders compressed inward. They watched his mother pull up in her Corolla. 15 minutes later, saw her run from the parking lot, saw her pull Marcus into her chest while she stood on those same concrete steps. None of them approached him that day. There was a protocol to recruitment, and part of that protocol was understanding that a 16-year-old who had just been cut from his school team was in a moment of crisis, not a moment of negotiation. But by that evening, all 3 scouts had filed reports with their athletic directors. By the following morning, the Duke athletic director had made a phone call to Susan Chen and asked her directly whether she wanted to explain what had happened to one of the top prospects in the region during an open recruitment period. Susan Chen was 62 years old and had spent 31 years in educational administration, the last 12 of those at Westridge Academy. She had built the school's academic reputation on the principle that all students deserve the right to develop their potential without artificial barriers. She had been in the room when the board had voted to create the financial aid program that had brought Marcus to Westridge in the first place. She had visited Marcus's mother during the application process and had heard directly about the choices she had made to give her son an opportunity. When the Duke athletic director told her that there was a top prospect at her school whose talent was being systematically suppressed by her basketball coach, Susan Chen did not ask for a meeting. She did not ask for Garrett's version of events. She went directly to her athletic administration files and found the notes from when the assistant coach had been removed from his position. She pulled the emails from that coach recommending Marcus for a starting position, emails that had been ignored. She looked at the practice schedule changes that had coincided with Marcus's decline in scout visibility. She reviewed the roster postings for the past 3 months and saw a pattern of playing time decisions that did not correspond to performance metrics she had access to. By the time Susan Chen was done with her examination of the documents, she understood not just that Garrett had made a decision to remove Marcus from the team, but that he had spent 3 months systematically diminishing Marcus's opportunities and visibility in a way designed to appear like performance-based coaching decisions rather than targeted exclusion. She called Garrett into her office on the morning of the 16th of February. Susan Chen was small, 5'3", with gray hair cut to her shoulders and a posture so upright that she seemed to occupy more space than her physical size suggested. She had trained herself to deliver difficult messages without changing her tone or facial expression, a skill that made those moments more severe rather than less so. "I've reviewed your coaching records," she said without asking Garrett to sit down, "and I've spoken with 3 college scouts who have contacted me about Marcus Jordan. Garrett had looked at her with an expression of polite confusion, the kind of look one makes when confronted with an accusation so disconnected from their self-perception that they cannot imagine it is genuine. I removed Marcus from the roster because he's not performing at the level this program requires, Garrett said flatly. That's a coaching decision. Susan Chen had opened her desk drawer and removed a folder. She had placed it directly in front of him and had not opened it. Those are copies of your emails authorizing the practice schedule changes in December, the notes from when you removed an assistant coach who recommended Marcus start, and the roster documents showing that Marcus's minutes declined by 68% between October and January, despite his shooting percentage increasing. The colleges that contacted me have footage of every game he's played. They've also told me they've heard rumors about your coaching methods at your previous schools. Rumors that I apparently did not investigate thoroughly enough when I hired you. Garrett had opened the folder and had looked at the documents without reading them, the way someone does when they are still trying to understand whether they are in actual danger or whether this is a misunderstanding. This school has policies about how coaches treat student athletes, Susan Chen continued. One of those policies is that coaching decisions must be based on documented performance criteria, not on a coach's personal preference about a student's attitude. Another policy is that financial aid students receive the same opportunities as any other student on campus. A third policy is that coaches do not remove assistant coaches for disagreeing with them. You have violated all three of those policies. I'm the basketball coach, Garrett had said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he believed this statement answered everything. You were the basketball coach, Susan Chen corrected him. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position pending an investigation into your conduct. You will surrender your office keys and your access badge by the end of business today. You will not have contact with any student-athlete without a witness present. You will not enter the gymnasium or any athletic facility. Garrett had stood up and his face had flushed red, and he had told Susan Chen that she was making a mistake, that he had done nothing wrong, that the removal of a struggling player from a team was a coaching prerogative. He had told her that she would regret this decision, that she was undermining his authority, that the program would suffer without him. Susan Chen had picked up the folder and had placed it back in her drawer. You are welcome to appeal this decision through our grievance procedures, she had said. You are not welcome in this building. Within 4 hours, that decision had reached the Scout Network. Within 8 hours, the athletic director at Duke had sent a private message to Marcus's mother, asking whether Marcus would be interested in attending an unofficial visit to campus. Within 24 hours, 2 additional programs had made similar contact. Within 72 hours, Derek Marshall, the independent trainer, had sent Marcus a training regimen and a note explaining that he was offering Marcus 10 hours of free training to help prepare him for the recruitment process, offered directly to him with no expectation of service in return. In the gymnasium at Westridge Academy, the interim coach who took over the program made 2 decisions on his first day. The first was to reinstate Marcus to the varsity roster in his original position. The second was to increase Marcus's playing time immediately, because the interim coach had been watching the team all season and understood perfectly well that Marcus was the most talented player he had access to. Marcus returned to the court on the 19th of February. The gymnasium was full that night, not because the school had promoted the game especially, but because word had circulated through the Scout Network. 8 coaches from Division I programs were in the stands. 4 assistant coaches from professional developmental leagues were present. The attendance seemed ordinary to everyone in the gymnasium except for those who knew what it meant. In the stands, Marcus's mother sat with her hands folded on her lap, watching her son warm up. She was wearing her good coat, the one she kept for important occasions. Her supervisor at the hospital had given her the evening off so she could attend this game, one of the first times in Marcus's entire basketball career that his mother had been able to watch him play during the regular season. Marcus did not see her until the game had already started, until the 4th possession, when he looked up into the bleachers and found her watching him with an expression of such focused attention that it felt like she was holding him together by the force of her looking. He scored 38 points that night. He added 11 assists. He had no turnovers in the second half. He moved the way someone moves when they have finally been given permission to be completely themselves in a space where that was allowed. The game ended, and the gymnasium filled with the sound of applause. But the applause was not just for the performance. It was acknowledgement of something else, something that hung in the air between the court and the stands. After the game, there was a formal assembly in the gymnasium. Susan Chen took the microphone, and she explained to the student body and the assembled coaches what had occurred. She told them that there had been a coaching decision that did not reflect the school's values. She told them that Westridge Academy had investigated the circumstances surrounding that decision and had made staffing changes. She told them that Marcus Jordan remained an exceptional student-athlete and that she apologized for the circumstances that had undermined his development. Then she introduced David Garrett, who had been compelled by the school's legal counsel to attend this assembly. Garrett stood at the center of the court, and he was asked directly by Susan Chen to explain his decision to cut Marcus from the team. Garrett had attempted to maintain his composure. He had looked out at the gymnasium, which was full of students and coaches and college scouts, and he had understood that his answer would be heard by people who could end his career. He had also understood that any answer, except a genuine apology, would be understood as an admission of racism that he could not afford to make publicly. "I made a mistake," he said, and the words came slowly, reluctantly, as if each one was being extracted from somewhere deep inside him. "I cut Marcus from the team based on my own assessment of his value, and my assessment was wrong. Marcus is a determined player who deserves to be on this team. I apologize for my decision and for the circumstances surrounding it." The word "determined" hung in the air, and everyone who heard it understood that it was the smallest, most inadequate word Garrett could have chosen, that it meant nothing and conveyed no genuine recognition of Marcus's talent or the damage that had been done. Marcus stood at the edge of the court and said nothing. He did not need to explain anything. The gymnasium already understood the truth of the situation, understood it in the way that truth settles over a space when it finally arrives after being absent for a long time. The aftermath of Garrett's removal from Westridge Academy happened quickly and irreversibly. By the end of the week, the school's board of trustees had voted to terminate his contract with cause, citing violation of student policies. An investigation into his conduct at his previous schools was initiated by the Athletic Coaching Association, a review that took 8 months and resulted in the finding that Garrett had engaged in a pattern of targeted mistreatment of black student-athletes at all 3 of his previous positions. He was suspended from high school coaching for 2 years and was required to complete extensive training in equity and inclusion before he would be permitted to return to coaching at that level. His permanent record was flagged, and he would never again be hired at a school of Westridge Academy's status. The assistant coach, who had been removed for disagreeing with Garrett, was reinstated with back pay and offered a position as assistant athletic director, a role in which he spent the following 3 years implementing coaching policies that made subjective decisions like Garrett's less possible in the future. The athletic director at Westridge Academy, meanwhile, launched a comprehensive review of all coaching decision-making processes, implementing documented evaluation criteria for all playing time decisions, and creating an accountability structure that required assistant coaches' input in roster changes. The financial aid office was expanded, and scholarships for student athletes were separated from coaching discretion, making it impossible for any future coach to threaten a student's educational access through playing time decisions. By the end of Marcus's senior year, he had been recruited by 11 Division I programs and had chosen to attend Duke University on a full scholarship that included academic support, living expenses, and professional development resources designed specifically for athletes transitioning from high school to collegiate competition. His mother attended his graduation from Westridge Academy, and she sat in the front row of the chapel, which was newly renovated with funding that had come from a foundation dedicated to providing educational access to students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation had been created by one of Marcus's grandmother's cousins, a woman who had heard Marcus's story during the controversy and had decided that something should be done structurally to prevent similar situations from occurring to other students. Marcus's mother watched her son walk across the stage, and she felt the weight of every choice she had made lift from her shoulders just slightly. She had not lifted it entirely, because the world was still the world, and they were still who they were in it. But the door that she had pushed open had held, and her son had walked through it, and the evidence of that was undeniable. At Duke, Marcus averaged 19 points and 8 assists as a freshman, numbers that made him immediately eligible for NBA draft consideration. By his sophomore year, he was being projected as a possible second-round pick in the following year's draft. By his junior year, he had declared early for the draft and was selected in the first round by a professional team, making him and his mother permanent recipients of generational wealth and stability. But the part of the story that mattered most to Marcus, the part he would return to whenever anyone asked him about his journey, was not the draft selection or the professional contract. It was the moment that he understood he had been given permission to be completely himself by someone in institutional authority, and that once you have that permission, it becomes harder for anyone to take it away. The first thing Marcus did after signing his professional contract was purchase a house for his mother. The house had 4 bedrooms and a sealed roof without any leaks. The windows opened and closed without resistance. There was no radiator that clanged all night. There was no foam and duct tape sealing the glass. There was a porch that did not sag, and his mother sat on that porch in the evening and looked out at the street without the weight of survival pressing down on her shoulders. The second thing Marcus did was establish a scholarship fund at Westridge Academy, an endowment specifically designed to support black male student-athletes from low-income backgrounds who were interested in playing on school teams. The fund was named after his mother, and it provided full tuition coverage, living expenses, and professional coaching in basketball and in navigating institutional spaces. The plaque that accompanied the fund, bolted into the wall of the gymnasium, read, "The Maria Jordan Scholarship for Excellence," created in honor of a woman who pushed her son toward an open door and who understood that every child deserves the chance to move completely into their own possibility. Marcus's mother attended the dedication ceremony for that plaque, and she stood in the gymnasium, where her son had been told he had no talent, and she understood finally that every sacrifice had been visible to him. Every choice to buy shoes instead of food, every double shift worked while her back was breaking, every night spent rewriting an essay to articulate her own resilience. All of it had registered with him, and he had transformed that into something that would outlast both of them. So let me ask you this. How many times have you watched someone make a decision about a person based on what they thought they understood about who that person was, only to have the whole story flip on its head later? How many times have you been in a room where someone said something cruel and everyone just looked at the floor? Because that's what this story is really about. It's not really about basketball. It's about what happens when authority decides to diminish someone. And what happens to that authority when it turns out that person was bigger than the authority ever understood. It's about a coach who thought he was making a choice, and what happened when he learned that he wasn't the only one making choices about that young man's future. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your life who deserves to have their door held open a little wider, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you'd been in that gymnasium that day. And if you know someone who needs to see a story about someone refusing to be diminished, send it to them. That's what these stories are for. That's how we take care of each other. Thank you.